questions orales, the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government, having failed to govern effectively, is now trying to shift the blame onto the opposition. Canadians did not want this Prime Minister to have a majority, yet he insists on acting like he has one. No consultation, muzzling anyone who disagrees, and then complaining when he doesn't get his way. Why doesn't the Prime Minister follow his own advice of 2 years ago, when he said it's Parliament that's supposed to run the country, and not just the leader of the largest party, and start working with the majority in this House who want to accomplish things for all Canadians in this country?
The Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the Federal Accountability Act, the Leader of the Opposition will remember that bill passed this House after 3 months of considerable debate and amendment, and passed this House without a single member standing in opposition to that. So what I say to the honourable member is, if he really wants the elected Parliament to run this House, then he should stand up and say where he actually stands on this issue, rather than leaving it to his unelected senators to undo the work of this House.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Prime Minister Fell knows, it took his unelected senators to pass 42 amendments because he couldn't do them properly in this House of Commons. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, we've offered to pass all six pieces of anti-crime legislation right away. The Prime Minister's response was, first, to take a cheap shot at the opposition in front of the President of Mexico. That must have really impressed him. Then to pretend the opposition wouldn't pass his crime legislation. When will the Prime Minister end his government's counterproductive arrogance and overly partisan approach and start seeking ways to make this minority Parliament work the way the members on this side of the House will?
The Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, once again, the Leader of the Opposition keeps misrepresenting the facts. In fact, when we were debating this spring, mandatory prison sentences for gun crimes, most of the members of the party opposite voted against that measure. If I can clarify, if the Leader of the Opposition is now prepared to give consent to that bill, are they prepared to reverse their position and support mandatory prison sentences for gun crimes, because that's what Canadians voted for?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, it is important to remind the Prime Minister that 2 years ago he said that the official opposition's responsibility was not to support the government holus bolus, but rather to keep the government accountable. So now he is threatening and confronting the opposition. The Canadian people have given the majority to the opposition. If the Prime Minister really wants to move forward on issues, why has he never consulted the 3 opposition leaders on any of the bills he has proposed? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Once again, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian people voted for accountability. They voted for a justice system that would be more fair and harder on real criminals. They did not vote for the corruption, the corrupt record of the Liberal, or by filibustering by the unelected Liberal Senate. The Honourable Member for Westmount Bilmati, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice has still not learned that leading a minority government is more than slogans and ideology. Decisions have to be based on fact, but they have to consult as well. The Liberal opposition has offered to pass 6 justice bills immediately. When will the Minister decide to put people's security ahead of his own interests? The Honourable Minister of Justice.
The fact that they're willing to pass at least 5 of those bills, and they should do it immediately. In respect of the 6th, what they did was gut the bill, allowed arsonists and break-and-enter artists and auto thefts to go back on house arrest. Canadians find that simply unacceptable. If they restore Bill C9, we will pass all 6.
The
Honourable Member for Westmount Bilmaki. Mr. Speaker, the minority government seems to want to ignore the facts in favor of its American ideology. The statistics show that the average age of people in jail is lower and lower. We wonder why young people are increasingly going to court and to jail for longer terms. Why does the government have no agenda for helping vulnerable people, young people, and helping families?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I do know is that Canadians are tired of the crime that is on the streets. They're tired of people stealing their cars over and over again and going home on house arrest. Canadians want to see change. They don't think that arsonists, in fact, should be on house arrest. They don't think that people who break into their home should be back in house arrest. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the members opposite to support the initiatives, not because we want it, but because Canadians want it.
L'honorable député de Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur le Président, dans un rapport rédigé par un ancien économiste en chef de la Banque mondiale, M. Nicholas Stern, on apprend que les changements climatiques entraînerait des coûts de 5 000 milliards de dollars à l'échelle mondiale. Le premier ministre britannique Tony Blair s'est dit très inquiet et juge que ce rapport est un cri d'alarme pour agir dès maintenant face aux...
The Prime Minister of Britain has said that this is a red flag, a cry of alarm, and I would like to know whether the government will agree with Prime Minister Blair and take real action that will be in line with Kyoto. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in the report, the author criticizes the Kyoto record often. We are making progress, and this is why we have introduced here in the House the air quality bill that will help with pollution and greenhouse gases. I hope that we get the support from the Bloc Québécois as well to reduce emissions. The Honourable Member. Well, the Prime Minister is not listening to environmentalists, economists, or even Tony Blair. Will he listen to military experts whom he usually trusts? They are saying that climate change will increase the rate at which the polar cap is melting, and therefore in 10 years the Northwest Passage will be open. Will the government quickly take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions responsible for climate change? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, we are developing a plan, a Made in Canada plan. I know that the leader of the Bloc Québécois wants to use American dollars, and he wants British foreign policy, it appears, but we want effective Made in Canada policies. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. The Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, is refusing to give the Quebec government the $328 million it needs to implement its environmental plan and meet the Kyoto objectives. The government is penalizing the Quebec. This is the Liberals' fault. How can the government deprive Quebec of this $328 million and blame other people? What is preventing him from providing this $328 million that Quebec needs immediately? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Merci, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that Quebec has a good environmental plan, but the government is concerned about Quebec's approach, which is based on voluntary agreements with industry. This is not acceptable to us or Quebecers. We need a national regulatory framework that is strict for all industries. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. On this side of the House, we are concerned by the federal government. The government is providing over $500 million to Ontario that is not implementing the Kyoto objectives and is denying the $328 million to Quebec that does have a plan. It is as if it is trying to prevent the Quebec government from trying to meet these objectives. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Even Mr. Boisclair and his supporters agree with our government's approach. for a long time. It has been clear that there is a meeting of objectives. We are working on clean air, and my question for my colleague, is whether you have permission to differ from the Parti québécois.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's Clean Air Act is dead in the water. We've watched for 13 years as the Liberals and the Conservatives dithered and bickered over climate change, while the air that Canadians are breathing is getting dirtier and dirtier. Climate change is the #1 threat to Canadians and to the planet. And yet we have a government that has no workable plan to get things done. It's not acceptable. We've got to do better than this. Is the Prime Minister ready to meet with the NDP in the next 24 hours to construct a plan to deal with climate change that will pass this House?
The Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
I wouldn't do it in a hotel room in Toronto, Mr. But, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the NDP began this Parliament by saying that the #1 air quality concern of Canadians was smog. Now he says it's greenhouse gases. We believe it's both, which is why the Clean Air Act covers both. This government is determined to move ahead with a long-term plan to reduce emissions of both these gases. But if the NDP wanted to sit down and discuss how we could do that better, I'm certainly willing to do that with them.
The Honourable Member for Toronto Danforth.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Prime Minister is serious. The need to act is there, and the money is required as the situation shows. Can the Prime Minister tell us whether he is indeed ready to work with the NDP to come up with a complete, effective plan that can be adopted by this Parliament? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I am always serious, and that is one of my problems, according to the media. I am always prepared to meet with the Leader of the NDP, to listen to his ideas.
For Ajax Pickering.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another Conservative promise made, another Conservative promise broken. From the first day the Accountability Act was introduced to the House, this Prime Minister pretended his party would follow its own rules. It did not. We now know the very day the Conservatives tabled this bill, they were raking in tens of thousands of dollars in cash, all exceeding donation limits they had just promised to keep. Once again, this government thinks they can say one thing and do another. Mr. Speaker, why should Canadians believe one word of this government's accountability rhetoric when they clearly don't even follow their own rules?
Honourable the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm always pleased to get questions from the member for Hotel California. When he's not here in Ottawa, he's consulting with senior Republican officials south of the border. I can tell him that since April the 11th, when we brought in the Federal Accountability Act, the Conservative Party of Canada has been voluntarily complying with that act. Very different from the Liberal Party of Canada, Mr. Speaker, who not only continues to rake in big corporate cash and big checks, Mr. Speaker, but what the Liberals are doing, Mr. Speaker, is trying to delay the Federal Accountability Act from applying to them. That's acting in the political interest, not in the best interest.
The Honourable Member for Ajax Pickering.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe the minister who's supposed to be responsible for accountability could actually show some and finally answer a question. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister made a commitment to follow the rules of the Accountability Act from day one. From the first day it was introduced and afterwards, they did not. He made a promise and he broke it. He upheld a principle and he broke it. To the tune of tens of thousands of dollars, they made a joke of their commitments and tried to mislead Canadians. There is a fundamental issue at stake here, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister broke his word on this, how can he be trusted? Why did he mislead Canadians, and why did he make a promise?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, very simply, the Conservative Fund Canada has voluntarily adhered to the guidelines in the Federal Accountability Act since April, an act that the Liberal Party is holding up in the Senate. So does the Liberal Party favour these donations or not? It's time the members stop sucking and blowing at the same time.
The honourable member for Mississauga. For the honourable member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, this minority Conservative government's obsession with secrecy and silencing public servants has spread to national defence. When asked by journalists to provide information on the Prime Minister's partisan political use of Canadian government jets, Defence Department officials were ordered by the powers to be to hide the true cost of the trip. Why is the government muzzling Defence Department officials? Was the minister ordered by the PMO to participate in this Challenger cover-up?
The Honourable the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, there has been no political interference at all within the practices of DND, which were originally set by the Liberal Party. We are following precisely the rules set by the previous administration.
The Honourable member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, information previously available through access to information is now regularly blacked out, just like the names on these flights. Derek Burney's name, scrubbed from the South flight to Washington. The names of the conservatives who took joyrides to Halifax and went to hockey games with the Prime Minister, gone. Last year, the Conservatives said it cost $11,000 per hour to operate these flying limousines. Now they only claim 10%. Why won't the government release the passenger list, and will the Conservative Party settle its outstanding bills?
That's right.
The Honourable the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we're following the practices of the previous government. We have paid for any flights that were not on official government business. And I want to point out that the previous government was using Challenger jets at twice the rate that this government is.
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Could the government tell us whether the best way of improving public security is to imprison young people as young as 12? Does the Minister of Justice not understand that Canadians do not agree with his radical approach, that in Quebec we have a better system that rehabilitates young people? We do not agree with imprisonment at 12.
Mr. Speaker, there are no plans to change the law in that respect, and I've never said that we would.
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, the philosophy of this government is worrisome and contradictory. They want more people in prison for longer terms. They do not want them outside moving freely. This sounds like an American Republican approach. Would he not be better off to take inspiration from Quebec that takes a preventive approach? Would that not be more logical, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, this government supports alternative measures, but when it comes to adult repeat offenders who violate the safety of Canadian citizens, all Canadians, including Quebecers, do not approve of the fact that those individuals should be on the street. Individuals who threaten the safety of our Canadian people on a repeated basis should be incarcerated.
The honourable member for Saint-Lambert. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the president of Disc criticized the government to in the area of telecommunications to have more regulation. There should be more decentralized decision-making and less American control. Does the government realize that this approach threatens not only culture, but our ability to control the content of our culture?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister of Industry. Mr. Speaker, with respect to telecommunications, this government has taken leadership here in the House and outside. I would ask the Bloc Québécois to work with us to have this policy approved by Parliament as soon as possible. The honourable member for Saint-Lambert. The president of ADISC also criticized the reduction of budgets for cultural troops going outside the country. And when the minister was asked whether the budgets had been cut, he said no, but in fact $4.6 million was cut by the Foreign Affairs. And the cultural troops are suffering from these cuts. How can the minister deny this evidence? The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Arts program was in fact briefly put on hold while an entire government review of expenditures was underway. Subsequent to that, we have resumed funding for artists for the international touring through the Arts Promotion Program. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the Minister of Culture, has in fact announced that the budget for the Canada Council for the Arts will be augmented by over $50 million in the next 2 years.
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour must explain the hiring of his advisor, Mr. Forêt, at a price of $1,000 a day for 24 days from March 7th to March 31st. But under this contract, he was working for the minister's office as of March 14th. So how was he getting two paychecks for two different jobs? The Honourable Minister of Labour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would have thought that the member was a little bit more higher quality than that this is completely false. Mr. Forêt, was in fact working for us in March, and then on April 3rd, he started working elsewhere, and then he was paid as of that time. So this register for public services, contrary to what you said, indicates March 14th. I just need 5 seconds. I am also working for the government as of the Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine. He has just confirmed what I said in my earlier question.
Why he gave Normand Forêt $24,000 for 24 days. What exactly did Mr. Forêt do during that period? And why did he put him on full-time salary according to the government's own internet site while he was still being paid for this contract? Was it to give Mr. Forêt a salary that exceeds Treasury Board guidelines? Last Friday in this House, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister refused to defend this minister. Will he...
The Honourable the Minister of Labour.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I will repeat to the House that this is false. Mr. Forêt worked under contract during March, and he started in my office on April 3rd, and the check stubs will prove that. As for this register, this is an electronic register under the government, and it indicates that Mr. Forêt started on March 14th, but myself, Jean-Pierre Blackburn, it indicates here that I've been working since November 1st, 2003. Can anyone explain that to me? The member for Bourassa?
Brampton Springdale.
The Honourable Member for Brampton Springdale.
Summer by snubbing the International AIDS Conference held in Toronto. He thought it was too political. That's a pretty weak excuse for a politician, Mr. Speaker. We were told a funding announcement would follow shortly. Well, the summer has come and gone, and we are still waiting. The Minister of Health has still not announced Canada's funding commitment for HIV and AIDS. When will this minister get out of semi-retirement, get to work, and start delivering results for healthcare for Canadians?
The Honourable the Minister of International Cooperation.
Mr. Speaker, this is a major obstacle in countries that need our assistance. To help deal with this disease, the government has spent $250 million to fight against AIDS, against malaria and polio. 60% of these funds will go to fight AIDS. At the G8, the Prime Minister announced that CETA will be spending over $400 million over the next 10 years to improve health in Africa.
Springdale.
Mr. Speaker, that's well and good, but what about Canadians in Canada who are dying of HIV and AIDS? Whether it's on wait time, or on the drug coverage, or immunization, and now AIDS research funding, this government just has not delivered. Healthcare remains a missing priority. No action, no leadership. Mr. Speaker, Canadians want to know the real reason why there hasn't been an AIDS announcement. Is it because the Conservative government has made the choice to not help those who are dying of HIV and AIDS?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is incorrect. In fact, this government has put an extra $472 million for AIDS and HIV sufferers in Canada that will go to support programs for vulnerable people, research, surveillance, public awareness, evaluation. Mr. Speaker, after 13 years of Liberal inaction, AIDS sufferers in Canada will get a government that looks after their interests.
The Honourable Member for Cambridge.
Speaker, Canada's Labour Code contains standards that are over 40 years old, standards designed for longer-term sort of 9-to-5 work, and as such fails to protect self-employed, contract workers, temporary workers, and the more modern reality of work. Can the Minister of Labour explain to this House the importance of tabling the Arthur's report on reforming Part 3 of the Labour Code?
Honourable the Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that today is an important event for Canada because Professor Harry Arthurs tabled his report to giving us 72 recommendations to us to change Part 3 of the Labour Code with respect to labour standards. So now, Mr. Speaker, we're going to read these recommendations. We will consult with our partners, employers, unions, and employees to see if we can get some consensus. And if that's the case, we will make changes to the Act.
Minister Coquitlam.
The MPtv has learned that the Chief of the Air Staff had serious concerns about the emphatic language used to counter suggestions that Canada would be deploying CF-18s to Afghanistan. Internal emails state, quote, CAF is concerned that this statement painted us into a corner for the future. If, for instance, our allies who currently provide support pull out and leave. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please explain why his generals were concerned by the categorical denial that CF-18s were to be deployed?
The Honourable the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, there has been no recommendation to deploy CF-18s, and they will not be deployed unless there is an operational requirement. And at this time, there is no operational requirement.
The member for New Westminster, Coquitlam.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Chief of the Air Staff and the Embassy in Washington were pretty sure that Canada would need CF-18s in Afghanistan, but the Minister has indicated he knew nothing of the issue. Yet his department ordered up a $1 million sole source contract to ready the fighter planes. Earlier this year, we heard repeated denials that the Leopard tanks would be deployed, yet they were. The Minister has admitted he didn't read his briefing book, Mr. Speaker. Is this just another example of the Minister not really knowing what's going on in his department?
The Honourable the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, recently we made a commitment to NATO that we will have 6 CF-18s ready for NATO if they require us. That's why the money was spent to fix up these CF-18s.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
This government's muzzling continues. For the first time ever, Canada's minority Conservative government is refusing to include environmental, Aboriginal and industry representation in the official delegation to the next Kyoto conference in Nairobi. Including these groups was a practice started 14 years ago. Is the Environment Minister expecting so much controversy at the Kyoto conference that she just doesn't want any real environmentalists around to contradict her?
The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, our government appreciates all of the consultations we have with both industry and environmental groups. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, more than 80 Canadian organizations are accredited observers in Nairobi. And I understand at this point 31 of them are confirmed to be attending to date. So we not only look forward to consulting with them here before we leave, we will also be giving them briefings on location in Nairobi.
The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Well, since the government won't amend its no-fly list to include environmental groups as part of the Canadian delegation, what about members of Parliament? Canadians deserve to be represented at this important international conference by parliamentarians who actually believe in Kyoto, not just Kyoto's enemies. Absolutely. Will the minister include representatives of all parties in the Canadian delegation, as has been the case every time in the last 14 years?
The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he's fishing for an invite to Kenya. But what I will say, Mr. Speaker, is we continue to work with all opposition parties on the Canadian submission on these issues. We look forward to hearing from the members before we leave about the views so that we can make sure that we represent Canada on the international stage, including all of the concerns that the opposition has. And I would just ask the member to please approach me anytime with his concerns.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we know that some of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in Canada are Ontario's coal-fired electricity plants. Canada's minority government is ignoring that fact. Ontario is still waiting for the $540 million that was set aside by the previous Liberal government to help them close those plants. That's right. Why hasn't this minority Conservative government paid its share to shut down coal-fired electricity production in Ontario?
The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, we've introduced a piece of legislation that will obviously require all industry, including the electricity sector. We'll be meeting with the OPG, the Ontario Power, to talk to them about the concerns we have about not only the greenhouse gas emissions that they have, but also the pollution issues coming out of the electricity sector. So I'd encourage the Honourable to work with us and encourage Ontario to come to the table to support the new regulations we'll be putting in place.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Ontario had a clean, clear, specific deal. $540 million from the federal government to shut coal-fired electricity production down. Right. The minister knows that the $540 million had nothing to do with transfers, equalization, health care, education, or any other support from the federal government to the Ontario government. This is something that will really deliver clean air for Ontario. When will the minister deliver the money? Mr. Speaker, where is Ontario's money?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
I know the Premier of Ontario is grumpy about some things, but the one thing he shouldn't be grumpy about is the funding of the Ontario-Canada Agreement, which is fully funded in Budget 2006. Not only that, but we recently signed an agreement on the collection of corporate taxes that'll save businesses in Ontario $100 million a year. Not only that, but the Canada-Ontario Agreement, thanks to the Prime Minister, was extended for an additional year, 6 years, fully funded.
The
Honourable Member for MPtv, Timiskaming. Mr. Speaker, Aboriginal housing is in such poor condition that one would think that they're living in the third world. Aboriginal housing comes under federal jurisdiction, but the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs does not seem to take this into account. How can the government show up at the Socioeconomic Forum in Mestawish and simply say, and I quote, the member for Lévis-Belchis, he says everything was already in the works. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Indian Affairs.
Thank my colleague for the question. Of course, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development was very proud to be a co-sponsor of the Socioeconomic Forum at Mestawish. He took part in a meaningful way and was very proud to be a part of the deliberations there. In relation to housing, Mr. Speaker, this minister's moved forward with one of the largest announcements we've seen in many years. $300 million for northern housing, $300 million for off-reserve housing. Mr. Speaker, we're taking action and we're very proud of that.
The Honourable Member for MPtv, Timiskaming. Mr. Speaker, one of the main issues of the forum was the lack of reserve housing, something which comes under federal jurisdiction. How can the Minister of Indian Affairs, who is responsible for them found a way to be absent from the farm the very day where the scarcity of reserve housing was on the agenda in a workshop. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indian Affairs.
Speaker, again, the Minister of Indian Affairs was very proud to be a co-sponsor of this event, and meaningful things came from this event, including deliberations on housing. But our government has moved forward with important funding announcements, $300 million for northern housing, $300 million for off-reserve housing, as well as a $450 million package, which is one of the largest investments we've seen in the last 10 years.
Wow. The Honourable Member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After tearing up Kyoto, this government is now rejecting the Stern report that says that action has to take place immediately to prevent disaster. Why does the government continue to play ostrich and refuse to do anything whatsoever before 2050? It will be far too late by then. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Speaker, the report stresses that there's been a lack of progress made worldwide on this issue. In fact, it's something that our government has said clearly and repeatedly from the beginning, that there has been a lack of progress in Canada under the previous government, in particular relation to the Kyoto Protocol. And the report also says that, quote, strong, deliberate policy decisions need to be made to motivate change. What we need, Mr. Speaker, is regulations. We need to regulate industry to cut their pollution and cut their greenhouse gases, and that's exactly what this government's doing.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton East.
Mr. Speaker, as we know all too well, in economically heated market areas across Canada, there's a great need for skilled tradespersons. On this National Skilled Trades Day, can the Minister of Human Resources and Social Development tell the House what initiatives Canada's new government is taking to encourage more Canadians to enter into apprenticeships and the skilled trades?
The Honourable the Minister of Social Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that more and more Canada's growth is going to be dependent upon people entering the skilled trades, from welders and carpenters to hairstylists and chefs. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why within the first 100 days of taking office, Canada's new government introduced 3 bold new initiatives that will benefit over 800,000 apprentices and tradespeople. Mr. Speaker, the Apprenticeship Incentive Grant, the Apprenticeship Job Creation Tax Credit, and the tradespeople tool tax deduction are just 3 examples of how Canada's new government is taking action.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North Centre.
Speaker, back to the British government report, which says that unchecked global warming will devastate the world economy on the scale of the Great Depression. The report says the world could lose up to 20% of GDP if greenhouse gases continue to rise. So, Mr. Speaker, now that the first comprehensive economic-based report on climate change has been completed, does this do what those countless other scientific studies couldn't, and that is force the Environment Minister to take climate change seriously as an environmental and as an economic issue?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, in fact, what motivated us to take serious action was the call from Canadians. They were worried about smog days. They're worried about the increases in greenhouse gases by up to 35% under the former government, which is why we've already moved, Mr. Speaker, to regulate every industry sector across the country for both greenhouse gases and air pollution. That is the kind of deliberate policy choice that will motivate change. That's the kind of policy decisions that this report calls for.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North Centre.
The Minister's climate change plan just doesn't cut it. It needs a major overhaul, and the NDP is willing to help. The Stern report says that climate change is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. British Prime Minister Tony Blair says unless we act now, not sometimes distant, but now, these consequences will be irreversible. So the UK PM gets it, the NDP gets it, it's just the Environment Minister who doesn't. So will the Minister of Finance look past the oil patch and towards the future? Will he make a real plan for climate change?
Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to working with all members of this House on our new legislation that will regulate both greenhouse gases and air pollution. It's what Canadians want. It's what Canadians deserve. And if the NDP has good ideas, I look forward to hearing from them.
Honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Mr. Speaker, since January, politics is rampant in ACOA. In the timing of announcements and the minister's arrogant attitude toward criticism and in the appointment to key public service positions. The former chief of staff to Premier Lord in New Brunswick has been appointed a vice president of ACOA. Now we hear a political operative from Premier Bin's office will be appointed to a similar position in PEI. Are Atlantic Canadians really expected to believe that the only qualified people to lead ACOA reside in the offices of tired Conservative premiers? Will the Prime Minister assure this House that he will not parachute any more partisans into a comfortable landing at ACOA?
The Honourable, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, that is, as always, as is the case with the member opposite, patently false.
Yes.
The position which he spoke of in New Brunswick was filled by a competent, long-serving member of the public service who went through an advertised, competitive process, advertised on the ACOA website, decided upon by an independent board appointed by the previous government. So, Mr. Speaker, this type of allegation is completely untrue. We're doing things differently. We're putting competent, professional public servants in place to administer the programs in Atlantic Canada.
Wow. The Honourable member for Fleetwood Port Hills.
Mr. Speaker, for 13 years the Liberals were shameful in breaking the promises they made to immigrants and Canadians. They promised to increase immigration but left 800,000 waiting in line to come here. The Liberals froze the funding that helps admitted immigrants improve their English or French languages as well as adapt to life in their community. Can the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration tell us whether new immigrants have a cause for hope that he is not repeating the mistakes of the old Liberal government?
Honourable, the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, immigrants do have lots of cause for hope, and Mr. Speaker, the member didn't go far enough. The Liberals, of course, introduced the head tax and then broke their promise to cut it. They promised to give work permits to off-campus students, Mr. Speaker. They broke that promise. But under this new government, Mr. Speaker, we've cut the head tax in half. Students can now get those off-campus work permits. The Minister of Human Resources is working on foreign credentials. And, Mr. Speaker, we've passed $307 million in new spending for settlement funding, something the Liberals voted against, Mr. Speaker. They should be ashamed.
The Honourable member for Malpet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Agriculture has indicated that his stacked task force has tabled a report with him. Will the Minister on the Canadian Wheat Board, yes, Mr. Speaker, will, on their attack on the Canadian Wheat Board, Mr. Speaker, but will the Minister at least confirm to the House that whatever recommendations are considered will not happen unless and until the farmers have a vote on a clear question as related to that report?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Agriculture.
Of course, Canada's new government is committed to marketing choice for farmers, and we're also committed to a strong voluntary wheat board, Mr. Speaker, something that farmers want and something this side of the House is very determined to make happen. I was very pleased that today the task force report, I was able to make that public today, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure farmers and other industry experts, perhaps even the member from Malpec, will find something interesting in there and look forward to contributions, Mr. Speaker, as we examine that report on a chart forward on marketing choice.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides, Level. Mr. Speaker, the newspapers have told us that John Bosco has been awarded Volunteer of the Year 2005, and he is asked for political asylum, but he's been expelled from Canada on October 3rd, and now he's in the Rwanda capital prison for more than a week. His children, aged 10 and 14, have been taken as well. How can the government justify the decision to expel this person, given that he had requested political asylum since he feared for his safety in his country of origin? The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Someone makes an application for a refugee claim. These applications are all determined by independent officers, Mr. Speaker. If someone meets the criteria, Mr. Speaker, as a refugee, they are accepted. Also, pre-removal risk assessments are done, Mr. Speaker, to determine if people are in danger. That said, Mr. Speaker, if there are incidents where people are endangered when they are returned to their home countries, obviously Canada will do everything it can, Mr. Speaker, to ensure their safety.
The honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's manufacturing sector is being decimated, and governments are standing idly by as industrial plants close and their workers become Walmart greeters. In the last Parliament, all parties agreed that the wages, pensions and collective agreements of workers needed to be protected when companies shut down. Bill C-55 passed through the House, but the Liberals refused to proclaim it into law. If the government will not live up to its responsibility to develop an industrial strategy to save Canadian jobs, will the Minister of Labour at least do right by Canadian workers and bring forward the bill that would protect the benefits they've already earned?
Honourable, the Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, indeed, in order to protect workers following bankruptcy, people can receive up to $3,000. We are now looking at the process, drafting legislation, and we will soon be able to inform the House of the evolution of the file.
That will conclude the question period for today. But I'm now prepared to rule on the question of privilege raised on Wednesday, October 25th, 2006 by the Honourable Member for Wascana concerning comments allegedly made by the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs last Thursday, October 19th, 2006.
I would like to thank the Honourable Member for raising this matter, as well as the Honourable Government House Leader for his response, for it gives me the opportunity to clarify the very limited role that the Speaker can play in situations of this sort.
Let us review the events to date. On October 19th, the Honourable Member for Bourassa rose on a point of order to object to remarks he alleged were made by the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was supported by the Honourable Member for Ajax Pickering, and since I had not heard the remarks complained of, I undertook, as I would usually do in such cases, to review the record and return to the House if necessary. On October 20th, the Honourable Member for Newmarket Aurora rose on a point of order and, quoting Standing Order 18, sought an apology for offensive and disrespectful remarks allegedly made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs the previous day. The Chair responded as follows. I quote myself here. The news of these statements is something that is new to me because I did not hear the comments or see any of the gestures that are alleged to have taken place. My staff have carefully reviewed the audio tapes of question period and the written transcript of Hansard, which I myself have seen, and of course there is no reference to these words in either. So I am unable to confirm any of the suggestions that have been made. I know several members say that they heard these remarks. However, in the circumstances, there is nothing further I can do at this time. End of quote. Now, the House Leader of the official opposition has risen on a question of privilege on this same matter and has provided the Chair with affidavits signed by several honourable members stating that they heard the offending remarks. In the meantime, of course, as the House knows, audio clips of the October 19th